Good morning, my dear friends. My name is Martha Jean Callahan. I'm 73 years old, living in Spokane, Washington, in a modest little house with a workshop where I carve wooden toys. From my window, I can see the drizzle sliding down the glass, and on the shelves behind me, there are rows of tiny horses, toy trains, and planes, each carved with patience and painted with bright colors. People around here know me as the toy grandma, and children knock on my door just to ask if I've made something new. But today, I don't want to talk about toys. I want to tell you about where I came from, because sometimes the past sits on your chest like a weight, and the only way to breathe is to let it out. I was born in 1951 in Hillsboro, Kansas, a small town where life looked neat and proper from the outside. My father, Harvey Callahan, owned the only auto parts shop in the county. He was tall, proud, his shirts always pressed, his shoes polished until they shone. People in town said he was a pillar of discipline, a man to be respected. My mother, Lorraine, worked at the library. Thin, quiet, glasses perched on her nose, she moved as if trying not to disturb the air. To outsiders, we were the perfect family. Inside our house, it was another story. Our days ticked like the hands of a clock. Wake up at 6, breakfast at 6:30, lunch at noon sharp, dinner at 7. Being late meant punishment. If I arrived a few minutes after the plate was set, my father would lift the food away and tell me, "Those who can't respect time don't deserve to eat." I learned to live by the second hand of the clock. The house itself was big, dark, creaking with every step. It had 4 bedrooms, a basement that smelled of rust and damp stone, and a wide porch that wrapped around the front. In the yard, a plum tree bent heavy with fruit each summer, branches so low they brushed my shoulders when I passed. I would climb high into that tree, hide between the leaves, and eat the warm plums until juice ran down my wrists. Up there, for a little while, I could forget the silence that ruled our house. At school, I was quiet. I studied hard, not out of love for books, but because failure meant shame. My father called low grades a disgrace, an insult to his name. I memorized everything, even what I didn't understand, repeating words like a machine. Friends? Only one, Janice Miller, the pharmacist's daughter. We played during recess, but she never set foot in my house. No one did. Sundays were sacred. We sat in the first row at church, my father slipping large bills into the collection plate for everyone to see. He shook hands with neighbors, chest high, pride radiating. "What a fine family," people whispered, and I smiled because that was my role, while my mother kept her eyes on the ground, clutching my hand so tightly it left red marks. That routine held until I was 8 years old, the year everything began to shift. One Sunday evening, after roast chicken and my mother's baked macaroni, my father leaned back in his chair and made an announcement. His voice was calm, almost cheerful, and that frightened me more than anger. "From now on, we'll have special family nights," he said. My mother's fork froze in the air. She lowered her eyes quickly, but I saw the flicker, fear, resignation. I couldn't tell which. After dinner, he told me to change into my pajamas. I obeyed because disobedience wasn't an option. When I returned to the living room, the lamps were dim. The black and white television stood in the center, showing nothing but static. My father sat in his armchair, moved closer than usual to the screen. He patted his knee. "Come here, Martha." It felt wrong. He wasn't affectionate, never was, but I climbed onto his lap, stiff and silent. A moment later, my mother came in carrying a bowl of pretzels. She sat across from us, slowly chewing, eyes fixed ahead, as if watching a program only she could see. The crunch of pretzels echoed in the silence. That night was the first of many. I didn't understand exactly what was happening, only that it was something secret, something that left me cold and uneasy. My father whispered words I didn't grasp, told me families all had private rituals, told me if I ever spoke of it, I'd be sent away, and my parents would go to jail. He painted the orphanage as a place of whips and hunger. My mother said nothing. She just kept eating, kernel by kernel, her face blank. From then on, Sunday nights changed. They became predictable in a way that made my stomach twist each week as the clock neared 7. I tried pretending to be sick, holding my belly, groaning at the table, but my father saw through it. "Stop acting," he said, his hand heavy on my shoulder, guiding me back to the dark room. At school, I shrank further. My teacher asked my mother once why I never raised my hand anymore, why I stayed alone during recess. My mother smiled politely, her voice smooth. "She's just shy. At home, she never stops talking." A lie, polished and ready. At home, I hardly spoke at all. Words felt dangerous. By the time I was 9, the family nights were routine. The television hissed, my father's voice grew stranger, my mother chewed steadily beside us. The crunch of pretzels became a sound I hated more than thunder. I began keeping small notes on scraps of paper, hidden in the lining of an old shoe in my closet. I didn't write feelings. Feelings were too heavy, only facts. The date, the time. Words my father repeated, the look in my mother's eyes. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe because somewhere deep inside, I believed one day those scraps would matter. Looking back now, from this quiet chair in Spokane, I see that was the beginning of my second life, the one that ran in secret, written in hurried lines on torn paper, while the other life, the one everyone saw, went on as if nothing was wrong. The years that followed pulled me deeper into that shadow. By the time I turned 10, Sundays were no longer the only nights. My father grew restless. Sometimes it was Wednesday, sometimes Friday after dinner. He would simply clear his throat, look at me, and I knew. My mother, without a word, reached for her bowl of pretzels or peanuts, always something to chew. The sound of her teeth was like a clock marking the minutes of my dread. The living room was no longer enough. One evening, he led me down into the basement. The steps were steep, the air colder than upstairs, smelling of damp concrete. He had arranged a chair against the wall, a lamp with a bare bulb swinging above, and a mattress folded in the corner. "This is our place now," he said. His voice was calm, almost proud, like he had built something important. My mother sat on that chair, her shadow long against the wall, watching. School became the only hours where I could breathe, though even there the air felt heavy. Teachers noticed I rarely spoke. My classmate Janice asked once why I never invited her over. I told her our house was always messy, that my mother didn't like guests. She shrugged, accepted the excuse, but the truth pressed on me. I wanted to scream it out, but the warnings rang louder. Orphanage, beatings, hunger, shame. When I was 11, a new teacher arrived, Miss Gloria Stevens, from Chicago. She was younger than the others, spoke fast, smiled easily. She asked us to write essays about dreams, fears, secrets we could tell only to paper. I poured myself into those pages, but carefully, never direct, never obvious. My words were wrapped in symbols, locked doors, broken clocks, a girl who lived inside a hollow tree. Miss Stevens read them and looked at me differently. "You write with an old soul, Martha," she said, her eyes sharp but kind. For the first time, I felt someone saw beneath the surface. Still, I stayed silent. Fear held my throat shut. At home, silence ruled, but anger seeped into the cracks. My father's store had begun losing money. Automobiles changed, parts weren't as easy to sell, and customers drifted away. He came home tense, his voice sharper, his hands heavier. My mother tiptoed around him, polishing her glasses again and again, as if clearer lenses could erase reality. Then came the night he dragged me to the backyard. The plum tree that once gave me comfort stood bare in the winter cold. He pushed me against the trunk, the bark rough against my back. My mother stood a few feet away, clutching her coat closed, chewing slowly, eyes blank as the moon. That night broke something in me. The house, the yard, even the tree I once loved. Nothing was safe anymore. Not long after, my father announced we were moving. He said the shop had failed. There was no future in Hillsboro. We were leaving for Toledo, Ohio, where he had a cousin who could get him work in a factory. I packed my few clothes and, hidden deep in the bottom, my scraps of paper with dates and notes. I couldn't leave them behind. They were the only proof that my nightmare wasn't imagined. Toledo was louder, dirtier, crowded with factory smoke and strangers. Our new home was a narrow brick house squeezed between two others. It had 2 bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, and a yard no bigger than a rug. I thought maybe in this new place the rituals would stop. Perhaps the exhaustion of factory shifts would dull him. For a few weeks, I even believed it. He came home late, his shirt stained, his face sagging with fatigue. He fell into bed, snoring before midnight. But one evening, he discovered the empty basement of the house next door. It had been abandoned, the door at the back broken. He swept a corner clean, spread blankets on the floor, and claimed it as his new stage. My mother followed him there without protest, carrying her ever-present bowl. The crunch of peanuts echoed off the brick walls as she sat in the dark. The sessions became wilder, less predictable. Sometimes twice a week, sometimes more. When he drank, his temper burned hotter. I came home from school with dread in my chest, never knowing when his hand would grab my arm. My body ached constantly. My mind drifted further away. To survive, I built an escape inside my head. I imagined living alone in a city far away. Portland, a place I had seen only in magazines at school. In my dream, I had a job in a small shop, friends who laughed with me, evenings with ice cream instead of fear. Still, scraps of reality kept piling up. In that abandoned basement, tucked behind old boxes, I once found an envelope of photographs. Women, girls, caught in moments they never agreed to, faces frozen in discomfort. In the corner of each photo, a mark, Callahan Studio. My stomach turned. He wasn't just destroying me. There were others. That discovery planted a new seed in me. Fear still strangled, but underneath it, a sharper feeling stirred. Anger. My scraps of paper grew into longer notes, hidden in the lining of my school bag. I began writing everything, not just dates, but details. What he said, where we were, how my mother sat, the foods she chewed. I didn't know how or when, but I swore to myself those words would matter someday. That was the second shift in my life. Hillsboro had trapped me in silence, but Toledo began to sharpen me. I was still a girl, still terrified, But now I carried something more than fear. I carried evidence. And though I didn't yet dare to speak, I knew one day I would. By the time I turned 14, silence had wrapped around me like a second skin. At school, I kept my head low, my notebooks filled with neat lines of words, but none of them told the truth. My classmates joked, whispered, lived their small dramas in the hallways. I drifted through like a shadow. Nobody knew that every evening I walked home with a knot in my stomach, wondering if it would be a basement night. In Toledo, the routine had become worse than in Kansas. My father no longer waited for weekends. Any night could be the night. He drank more heavily now, the factory weighing on him, and his temper boiled fast. Sometimes he stumbled through the door red-faced, slammed his fists on the table, and then turned those fists toward me. My mother, always there, always chewing something, pretzels, peanuts, anything that cracked between her teeth, sat quietly watching. One winter night, when snow pressed against the windows and the furnace rattled weakly, I decided to sneak into the neighbor's abandoned basement in daylight. I needed to see it differently, without his shadow controlling it. The floor was damp, scattered with tools and broken furniture. In the far corner, hidden under a box of rusted nails, I found a second envelope. This one was worse. It held not only photographs but strips of film, negatives, dark and curled. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would echo through the walls. He hadn't just taken pictures, he had recorded everything. I shoved the envelope under my coat and carried it back to my room. My hand shook as I flipped through the images, recognizing not only myself, but faces I'd seen in Hillsboro. Women from church, older girls from school. My stomach churned. The secret was bigger than I had imagined. That night, I hid the envelope beneath the loose floorboard near my bed, right beside the stack of notes I had been keeping since I was 9. Together, they felt heavy, dangerous, but also powerful. For the first time, I understood I held proof, not just of my own torment, but of his crimes against others. At 15, my body was frail from stress. I couldn't sleep. Headaches split my temples. Food tasted like ash. My teachers noticed. One day, the guidance counselor, Mrs. Clark, called me into her office. She leaned across her desk, her eyes kind but sharp. "Martha, your grades are slipping. You've lost weight. Is something happening at home?" My lips trembled, but the words refused to come. My father's threats still wrapped around me. "If you talk, they'll lock us away, and you'll rot in an orphanage." Shame was worse than fear. I shook my head, muttered something about moving, about stress. She sighed, handed me a note for my parents to sign, and sent me back. I tore it to pieces in the hallway. That night, lying awake with the floorboard lifted just enough to glimpse the envelope, a thought came sharper than any before. I cannot survive much longer like this. If I stayed silent, I would not see 16. My only chance was to turn those scraps and photographs into a weapon. I began to plan, quietly, cautiously. I studied bus schedules at the library. I asked harmless questions about police stations in the city center. I practiced lying to my parents about after-school activities, so that one day, when I truly disappeared for a few hours, it would not draw suspicion. The breaking point arrived sooner than I expected. One night, my father came home angrier than ever. He raged about the factory, about his supervisor humiliating him in front of others. His words slurred, his fists clenched, and when his eyes fixed on me, I saw something final in them, like he was ready to destroy me completely. That night, even my mother looked uneasy. Her chewing faltered, a pretzel half broken in her hand. After he finally stumbled into bed, I sat awake until dawn, staring at the cracked ceiling. My choice was clear. Either I remained silent and let myself vanish piece by piece, or I risked everything and spoke. The next afternoon, when both my parents were at work, I pulled the envelope from under the floorboard and slid my bundle of notes into my school bag. My hands trembled, but my legs carried me fast, down the street, onto the bus that rattled toward downtown Toledo. I had rehearsed this moment in my head for months, but now my breath came short, my heart slamming against my ribs. The police station loomed gray and square on the corner of Michigan Avenue. I hesitated at the steps, the cold wind biting my cheeks, then forced myself inside. The lobby smelled of paper and old coffee. A man behind the desk looked up, ready to dismiss me as just another schoolgirl. I swallowed hard and whispered, "I need to speak to a woman officer, please." Minutes later, a tall woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a bun entered the room. Her badge read, "Detective Alma Ruiz." Her eyes, sharp but steady, fixed on mine. "Come with me," she said. In a small office, I sat across from her, the envelope heavy in my lap. She waited patiently, no rush, no pressure, just a quiet space that invited words. My throat burned, but I opened my notebook and pushed it toward her. "This is everything," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. For the first time in years, I felt the door of silence crack open, and once it opened, I knew I would never let it close again. Detective Ruiz shut the office door behind her and sat across from me. Her posture was strict, but her voice was unexpectedly soft. "You can take your time, Martha. Start wherever you need." My hands shook as I opened the envelope. The photographs spilled across the desk, black and white faces frozen in moments they had never chosen. Her eyes narrowed as she examined them. Then she looked at me with a steadiness that made my pulse slow. "Did your father take these?" I nodded. The truth finally out of my mouth felt like a stone rolling off my chest. She flipped through my notebooks, page after page of cramped handwriting, dates, details, words I had buried in silence for years. The room was silent except for the turning of pages. Finally, she closed the last one and said, "You were right to come. What you've carried, this is evidence, and it's going to stop now." I expected disbelief, maybe dismissal. Instead, she believed me instantly. Relief tangled with terror. If she believed, then everything would move forward, and my father would know I had betrayed him. That same evening, they placed me in a safe house run by nuns. The building was small, plain brick, but when the heavy door shut behind me, for the first time I felt a sliver of safety. Sister Margaret, a tall woman with kind eyes, showed me a small room with a narrow bed. "You're safe here," she said simply. Safe. A word I had almost forgotten. The next day, Detective Ruiz returned. She told me my father had been taken into custody that morning. When police searched the abandoned basement, they found more envelopes, rolls of undeveloped film, and even a camera hidden in a metal box. "He didn't just abuse," she said, her voice clipped with anger. "He recorded, archived, collected." I braced myself for what I had to ask. "And my mother?" Her face hardened. "She was there, wasn't she?" I nodded. "She was arrested too," the detective said after a pause. "We found her handwriting on envelopes. Some photographs were taken by her hand. She wasn't only watching, Martha. she was participating. The words cut sharper than any blade. For years I told myself she was afraid, trapped, powerless. But this truth, her choice to take part, broke something final inside me. That night, I wept into the thin pillow at the safe house, not for my father, not for the life I lost, but for the mother I realized had never truly been mine. Days blurred into weeks. Prosecutors prepared charges. Detectives returned again and again for details. Each time I sat across the table, I told more. I recited times, places, what they said, what they did. I felt stripped bare, but every word built the case against them. Then came the day of my testimony. They brought me to a courthouse with tall columns and cold marble floors. I wasn't taken into the main chamber. Instead, they led me into a small room with a camera. Only the judge, the prosecutor, and Detective Ruiz sat with me. The prosecutor, a man named Daniel Brooks, leaned forward. "Martha, your words will carry weight. Speak clearly, and remember, you are not the one on trial." I told everything, from the first family night in Hillsborough to the last in Toledo's abandoned basement. I spoke until my voice cracked and my throat felt raw. Judge Morgan asked questions, precise, pointed, but always respectful. When it was done, I collapsed into the chair, exhausted but strangely lighter, as if years of chains had been cut. Outside, Sister Margaret squeezed my hand. "You've done what most grown men could never do," she whispered. I didn't feel heroic, but I felt alive. 2 days later, Ruiz visited again. She carried a folder, but smiled faintly. "The judge ordered both your parents to remain in custody until trial. They won't be coming near you again." Her next words startled me. "Because your testimony is so critical, we're offering placement in the Witness Protection Program. New identity, new city, new start." A new start. The phrase hummed in my mind all night. I thought of Portland, the city I had imagined during every nightmare, a place with streets unknown, where I could walk without fear of a hand pulling me back. I told Ruiz, "Yes, I want that. I don't want to be Martha Callahan anymore." 3 days later, she returned with documents. My new name would be Martha Jean Carter. New birth certificate, new school enrollment, a small apartment waiting in Oregon. I stared at the papers, tracing the letters of my new last name with trembling fingers. Carter, a clean slate. The morning I left Toledo, Sister Margaret hugged me at the bus station. "The past is heavy, child, but don't carry it longer than you must." The bus pulled away, the city shrinking in the window, and I realized this was the first journey of my life that belonged to me alone. My parents sat in jail cells, stripped of their masks, while I rode toward a place they could never follow. That was the day revenge began, not with violence, not with shouting, but with truth laid bare in the cold light of justice. The bus rolled into Portland on a gray October morning. Rain streaked the windows, blurring the skyline into a wash of steel and fog. I stepped onto the wet pavement with one suitcase, a new set of papers in my pocket, and a name that felt strange on my tongue: Martha Carter. For 17 years, I had been trapped inside walls of silence. Now I was standing in a city where no one knew me. No one whispered about my father's reputation. No one watched me through clenched jaws and chewing teeth. A woman in a navy coat waited near the station doors. "I'm Teresa," she said, holding an umbrella over both of us. She was a social worker with the Witness Program, calm and efficient. She walked me through the streets, explaining bus lines, grocery stores, the small apartment arranged for me in the Hawthorne district. The building was plain brick, my unit barely 2 rooms, a bed, a stove, a narrow window. But when I closed the door that night and turned the key, the silence was different. It was mine. The first weeks were hard. Freedom sounds like a gift until you have to live it. I had never bought my own groceries before, never cooked more than toast, never decided what to do with an evening. I burned rice, missed buses, locked myself out twice. But each mistake was my own, not punished by fists or cold stares. At night, I lay awake, listening to the rain on the roof, forcing myself to believe no one would storm through the door. The habit of fear didn't vanish easily. Every knock, every footstep in the hall made my body tense. Still, little by little, the fear began to crack. I enrolled in night classes to finish high school. Sitting in a classroom as an almost grown woman felt strange, but I forced myself to raise my hand to speak out loud. The teacher, Mr. Adams, encouraged me. "You've got a sharp mind," he said once, handing back a paper with an A. Those words, so simple, meant more than he could know. During the day, I found work at a fabric store downtown. The owner, Mrs. Lane, hired me to fold cloth, sweep floors, and help customers choose patterns. The shop smelled of dye and starch, and bolts of bright fabric leaned against the walls like giant books. For the first time, I earned money that was mine. I bought a blue coat from the discount rack, my first purchase chosen only by me. It was in that store that I met David. He was a supplier from Seattle, tall but gentle, carrying samples of new textiles in heavy suitcases. He spoke softly, asked questions without pressing, and always treated me with respect. At first, I avoided him, answering with nods, ducking away. Men had always meant danger, but he never pushed. Month after month, he returned, telling stories about the ocean, about books he read, about his dream of opening his own shop. One afternoon, as I arranged fabric on a shelf, he stopped beside me. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" My stomach tightened. My instinct screamed to say no, but something in his steady eyes broke through my fear. Against every habit, I whispered, "Yes." It took nearly a year before I allowed him close. Our first coffee stretched into long walks in Washington Park, into quiet evenings at the cinema. With him, I learned that touch didn't have to mean harm, that a hand could rest gently without control, that laughter could replace silence. At 22, we married in a small church, just a handful of friends, and a plain white cake. For the first time in my life, the word family didn't taste bitter. We bought a small house in the same neighborhood as my apartment. He opened his store. I worked beside him. Years passed in rhythm, customers, fabric rolls, quiet dinners. Happiness didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces, like sunlight slipping through shutters. Still, the past didn't vanish. Nights brought dreams that twisted me awake. Sometimes, walking home in the rain, the smell of wet stone pulled me back to that basement in Toledo. But David never questioned my silences. He simply held me until the trembling eased. When doctors told us children might never come, I grieved. Scars inside me, they said, likely the cause. David only shook his head. "We're already enough," he whispered, and I believed him. By the time I reached 30, I felt something I never thought possible. Normal. I saw the ocean at Cannon Beach, waves crashing against black rocks, salt wind in my hair. I remember standing there, the horizon endless, thinking, I survived, and now I will live. That was the start of my true life, not the one defined by secrets, but the one I built with my own hands. Every toy I carve today, every train and wooden horse, is another reminder I am free, and I will never be silent again. By the time I turned 58, I thought the storm was far behind me. The shop David and I built together had grown steady. We had neighbors who waved each morning, friends who came for dinner, a life stitched with calm. For years, that quiet was my greatest treasure. Then, one winter afternoon, David collapsed behind the counter of our store, a sharp pain in his chest, a gasp, and he was gone before the ambulance could reach us. Pancreatic cancer, the doctors said later. 6 months earlier, he had been fine, laughing, planning a trip to the coast. Then the disease struck like lightning, and suddenly my world was stripped bare. The house felt unbearably silent after his death. I would wake in the night and reach for his side of the bed, only to find cold sheets. The store, once alive with his voice, stood empty when I tried to run it alone. I lasted 3 months before selling it. Without him, every bolt of fabric, every shelf was only an echo. I drifted for a long time. Days passed in slow motion. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the same cup of coffee, the hours stretching like shadows. Friends visited, tried to comfort me, but their words dissolved into air. I thought the darkness from my childhood had finally found me again, waiting for me in widowhood. One afternoon, my goddaughter Cecilia came to see me. She was the daughter of Janice, my childhood friend from Kansas, who by chance had moved to Oregon years earlier. Cecilia placed a small box of clay on my table. "Aunt Martha," she said gently, "use your hands. The heart calms when the hands are busy." At first I resisted. What good would clay do against grief? But she left it anyway, and one evening, restless and hollow, I opened the box. The cool, damp weight of the clay pressed between my fingers. I shaped it clumsily, rolling it, flattening it, pinching it into a rough little bird. It was crooked, uneven, but when I set it on the table, something stirred inside me, the faintest spark of focus, of creation. The next week, Cecilia enrolled me in a ceramics class at the community center. I almost didn't go, but loneliness pushed me through the door. There I sat among strangers, our hands deep in clay. We shaped bowls, cups, vases. My first pieces cracked in the kiln, but even broken, they gave me a reason to rise from bed. One day, inspired by a photo in a folk art magazine, I tried to mold a small guinea fowl. Its rounded body, dotted with white spots, made me laugh for the first time in months. I painted it black with tiny flecks of white, placed it on my shelf, and stared at it as though it were alive. From then on, I made another and another, each one different, some tall, some squat, some with tilted heads. Soon the shelves filled with rows of spotted birds, each with a personality of its own. Neighbors who stopped by asked if they could buy one. Then strangers began knocking. Within a year, I was selling them at craft fairs. By 60, I had a website. Imagine that. A woman my age selling guinea fowl figurines online. The work gave me rhythm. Every morning I brewed coffee, walked to my workshop, rolled out clay, painted, fired pieces in the kiln. The hours no longer dragged. They moved with purpose. Each bird was more than decoration. It was proof that I could create life out of nothing, that I could transform grief into art. Children from the neighborhood often visited, curious about the kiln, fascinated by the rows of painted birds. I let them mold little animals from spare clay. Watching their eyes light up as they held their finished pieces filled me with joy I thought I'd lost forever. Their laughter echoed in the room where silence once lived. Of course, grief never fully left me. Night still brought tears, memories of David's quiet smile, his steady hands. But carving and painting gave me a way to carry the sorrow without drowning in it. I realized that loss doesn't end us, it reshapes us. At 73, sitting here in my chair in Spokane, surrounded by shelves crowded with spotted guinea fowl, I know this. The girl who once hid scraps of paper under floorboards became the woman who filled a house with birds of clay. From fear to freedom, from silence to laughter, from ashes to creation, that is the road I walked. And the journey isn't finished yet.